This lake house would be perfect for Victoria, my father announced during what was supposed to be a casual family dinner, his voice carrying that familiar tone of false casualness that always preceded his worst decisions. In fact, I've already transferred it to her name. She deserves a nice summer home. I set down my fork carefully, studying my father's smug expression and Victoria's triumphant smile. At 32, I'd spent years watching my father hand things to his new wife that didn't belong to him. But this time was different. This time, I was ready. Really? I kept my voice light, years of practice hiding the steel beneath. That's interesting, Dad. You should check those records again. My name is Olivia Bennett, and that lake house meant everything to me. My grandmother had left it to me when she passed away 5 years ago, her final gift to the granddaughter who'd spent every summer helping her tend her beloved garden and restore the old wooden dock. The property had been in our family for generations, each room holding memories of lazy summer days and cozy winter retreats. Victoria, my father's wife of 3 years, had been eyeing it since the day she first saw it. At 28, just 4 years younger than me, she had married my father with the kind of calculated precision that would have been admirable if it wasn't so transparent. My father, still reeling from my mother's death and desperate to feel young again, had fallen for her act completely. What do you mean, check the records? Victoria's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and suspicious. She'd always been good at sensing when things weren't going her way. I reached for my phone, pulling up an email I'd received that morning. The lake house can't be in your name, Victoria, because as of 8 o'clock this morning, it's been placed in an irrevocable trust. My grandmother made sure of that. My father's face darkened. What are you talking about? The deed was clear. The property passed to you, and I have power of attorney. I handled the transfer myself. Did you? I smiled, sliding my phone across the table. Maybe you should look at the original will again. The one filed with Grandma's lawyer, not the copy you had in your office. 6 months ago, I'd received a call from Mr. Sullivan, my grandmother's longtime attorney. He'd been concerned about some inquiries made about the property's title. Your father's been asking questions, he warned me. Questions that make me think he's planning something. That's when I learned about my grandmother's true gift, not just the lake house, but the legal protections she put in place to keep it safe. The property had been placed in a trust that would activate upon any attempt to transfer ownership without proper authorization. My grandmother, it seemed, had known my father better than anyone. This is ridiculous, Victoria snapped, her perfect manicure tapping angrily against her wine glass. James, tell her this is ridiculous. But my father was staring at the documents on my phone, his face growing paler by the second. The trust documents were clear. Any unauthorized attempt to transfer the property would trigger immediate legal consequences. You can't do this, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I'm your father. And this was my grandmother's house, I replied calmly. She left it to me for a reason. Did you really think she wouldn't protect it? Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You ungrateful little. Careful, I interrupted. The trust has very specific provisions about harassment or interference. Mr. Sullivan is quite thorough in his documentation. The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked like he aged 10 years in 10 minutes, while Victoria's perfect composure had cracked completely. The renovation plans, she whispered more to herself than to us. The contractors are starting next week. I took a sip of my water, letting the moment stretch. You'll need to cancel those. Any modifications to the property require written authorization from the trust administrator. That would be me. My father started to speak, probably to try another angle of attack, but I held up my hand. There's more. The trust includes detailed records of every attempt to access or transfer the property over the past 6 months, including some interesting conversations with real estate agents about potential buyers. That got their attention. Victoria's face went from angry red to pale white in seconds, while my father seemed to sink further into his chair. You've been trying to sell it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mr. Sullivan's investigation had been thorough, even before this supposed transfer to Victoria. That's interesting, considering you knew Grandma left it to me specifically because she wanted it to stay in the family. We were just exploring options. Victoria tried to backpedal, but her voice lacked conviction. For the future, you know, property values in that area are rising. I finished for her. Yes, I know. That's why the trust includes a provision preventing any sale without unanimous agreement from all beneficiaries. And since I'm the only beneficiary, the implications hung in the air. Not only had their attempt to transfer the property failed, but their broader plans to sell it for a profit were now impossible. My father finally found his voice. "You don't understand, Olivia. Victoria and I, we had plans. The sale would have given us the capital to what, Dad? Fund another of Victoria's business ventures, like the boutique that mysteriously closed after 6 months, or maybe the yoga studio that never actually opened." Victoria's face flushed with anger. "How dare you? James, are you going to let her talk to me like this?" But my father was still staring at the trust documents, reality finally sinking in. He'd lost not just the lake house, but the potential windfall they'd been counting on. I stood up, gathering my things. "The trust administrator, that's me, will be conducting a property inspection next weekend. I'll need you to remove any personal items you've left there. After that, the security codes will be changed." "You can't just," Victoria started, but I cut her off. "I can, and I will. Grandma made sure of that. She saw this coming, you know. She told Mr. Sullivan that my father would try something like this eventually. That's why she set up the trust the way she did." I walked to the door, then turned back for one final point. "Oh, and Dad, you might want to check your email. Mr. Sullivan sent over some interesting documentation about your use of power of attorney. He thinks there might be some irregularities worth discussing." The look on their faces as I left was something I'd remember for a long time. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting what was mine, what my grandmother had entrusted to me. As I drove home that evening, I thought about all the summers spent at that lake house, helping my grandmother tend her garden and listening to her stories. She taught me more than just how to care for plants. She taught me how to stand up for myself, how to protect what mattered. Sometimes, Olivia, she told me once as we sat on the dock watching the sunset, the best defense is being prepared. People will always try to take what isn't theirs, but they can only succeed if you let them. She'd been right, as usual. And now, thanks to her foresight, the lake house would stay exactly where it belonged, in the hands of someone who truly appreciated its value. My phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Sullivan. "Everything go as planned." I smiled, typing back a quick response. Exactly as Grandma would have wanted. The lake house was safe, and with it all the memories and promises it held. Sometimes, the best victories are the ones you plan for long before the battle begins. The fallout from the dinner revelation was swift and explosive. The next morning, my phone was flooded with messages, angry texts from Victoria, pleading voicemails from my father, and even a few confused inquiries from family friends who had apparently been promised use of the lake house for their summer vacations. I forwarded each message to Mr. Sullivan, adding to his already substantial documentation of their behavior. "They're getting desperate," he noted during our morning call. "Your father just tried to schedule an emergency meeting with me. Claimed there must be some mistake in the trust documents." "Was there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Your grandmother didn't make mistakes, Olivia, especially not when it came to protecting what mattered to her." Later that afternoon, I drove out to the lake house, needing to see for myself what changes they had already made. As I pulled up the familiar gravel driveway, my heart sank. The garden my grandmother had lovingly tended for decades was partially dug up, presumably in preparation for Victoria's planned modernization. Construction materials were piled near the dock, and a large dumpster sat filled with what looked like original fixtures from the house. I was taking pictures of the damage when a car roared up the driveway. Victoria stepped out, looking less polished than usual in her hurry to confront me. "You have no right to be here," she snapped, striding toward me in her impractical heels. "James and I have already paid deposits to the contractors. We have plans." I lowered my phone, making sure the photos were safely backed up to the cloud. "Actually, you're the one who has no right to be here. As of this morning, the security company has been instructed to treat any unauthorized entry as trespassing." "Trespassing?" She laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria to it. "I'm James's wife. This is our summer home." "No, it's my property, held in a trust established by my grandmother. And those contractors you hired, they've all been notified that any work performed without proper authorization will result in legal action." Victoria's face contorted with rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But you have no idea what you're doing. James and I had buyers lined up, wealthy buyers. This could have set us all up for life. Set you up, you mean? I corrected her. Just like you thought marrying my father would set you up. How's that working out for you? She took a step toward me, finger pointed accusingly. Everything was fine until you interfered. We had plans for this place, plans that would have benefited everyone. Everyone except me, I said calmly, and everyone except my grandmother, who wanted this place preserved, not torn down and commercialized. Your grandmother is dead, Victoria spat, and you're living in the past, clinging to this old house like it's some kind of shrine. The words hit hard, but I kept my composure. You're right about one thing. I am preserving this place, but not just because of the past. Because of what it represents, what it can still be. Just then, another car pulled up, my father's. He got out slowly, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Victoria, he called out, his voice weary. I told you not to come here. Mr. Sullivan just finished explaining everything to me. The trust is ironclad. Victoria whirled on him. You said you could handle this. You said the power of attorney meet. I was wrong. He cut her off, and for the first time, I heard real regret in his voice. About a lot of things. I watched their exchange with a strange sense of detachment. This was the moment my father had to choose between his new wife's schemes and his daughter's inheritance, between quick profit and lasting legacy. The contractors, Victoria pressed. The deposits will have to be forfeited, my father finished. We had no right to authorize those changes. The trust makes that very clear. Victoria's face went through a series of emotions: anger, disbelief, calculation, and finally, a cold sort of fury. Without another word, she stormed back to her car and peeled out of the driveway, leaving my father and me standing in the aftermath of her dust. I'm sorry, he said finally, looking at the half-destroyed garden. Your grandmother, she loved this place so much. She did, I agreed, and she trusted me to protect it, not just the house, Dad, but everything it stands for. The memories, the history, the future she imagined for it. He nodded slowly. I forgot that somewhere along the way. Got caught up in Victoria's vision of luxury renovations and profitable flips. Your mother would have been so disappointed in me. The mention of my mother, gone now for 5 years, hung heavy in the air between us. She had loved this place too, had supported my grandmother's decision to leave it to me. It's not too late, I said finally. The garden can be replanted. The fixtures in that dumpster can be salvaged. It'll take work, but it's worth saving, he finished, just like your grandmother always said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the mistakes and poor choices to the father I remember from my childhood. The one who used to help me build sandcastles on the lake's beach, who taught me to fish off the old dock. You're welcome to help, I offered. With the restoration, if you want to. His eyes met mine, hopeful but hesitant, even after everything. The trust exists to protect the property, I said carefully, but it doesn't have to keep out family. Real family, Dad. People who understand what this place means. He looked around at the garden, the house, the lake sparkling beyond. Victoria won't like that. Victoria has a choice to make then, I replied. Just like you did. In that moment, standing amid the wreckage of my grandmother's garden, I realized that sometimes saving a place means more than just protecting its legal ownership. Sometimes it means giving people a chance to remember what really matters, to choose legacy over profit, family over facades. My father picked up a discarded garden tool. Where should we start? I smiled, thinking of all the summers spent working alongside my grandmother in this very garden. She always said the best place to start is wherever you're standing. Together, we began the work of restoration, not just of the garden, but perhaps of something more fundamental. It wouldn't be easy. Victoria's influence still hung over my father like a shadow, and trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But as we worked, I could almost hear my grandmother's voice on the breeze. Sometimes, Olivia, the greatest victories aren't in winning the fight, but in what you choose to build afterward. Over the next few weeks, the true scope of Victoria and my father's planned changes to the lake house became painfully clear. While sorting through paperwork in my father's home office, I discovered architectural plans that would have completely transformed the property, turning the charming, historic lake house into a modern luxury retreat with room for 50 guests. The contractors' invoices told an even more disturbing story. They had been hired to begin work without permits, rushing to make changes before anyone could object. The more I dug, the more evidence I found of Victoria's influence, each modification designed to maximize profit potential with no regard for the property's history or meaning. One evening, as I was reviewing the documents with Mr. Sullivan via video call, my father knocked on my door. He looked uncomfortable, clutching a manila envelope. "There's something else you need to see," he said, placing the envelope on my desk. Victoria, she had plans beyond just renovating the house. Inside were marketing materials for Lake Victoria Resort and Spa, complete with renderings showing my grandmother's beloved home transformed into something unrecognizable. The garden would have become a parking lot, the old dock replaced by a modern marina. She had investors lined up, my father admitted, his voice heavy with shame. That's why she was so confident about the transfer. They were ready to begin construction as soon as the property changed hands. I felt physically ill looking at the glossy brochures. "And you agreed to this?" He sat down heavily in the chair across from me. She made it sound so reasonable. Said we were foolish to let such valuable property sit unused most of the year. Called it unlocking its potential. Unused? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "Dad, I use this house. I maintain it. I share it with family and friends. Just because we're not charging $500 a night doesn't mean it's going to waste." Before he could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Your precious lake house won't stay yours forever. Everyone has a price." I showed the message to my father. His face fell further. "She's been like this since you revealed the trust," he said. Angry, calculating. "This isn't the woman I married." "Or maybe it is," I suggested gently. "Maybe this is exactly who she's always been, and you're just finally seeing it." The next day, Mr. Sullivan called with news that confirmed my suspicions. His investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar schemes in Victoria's past. Failed resort developments, property flips that left investors high and dry, businesses that collapse under suspicious circumstances. "She's done this before," he explained. "Finds wealthy older men, gains their trust, then uses their assets and connections for her real estate ventures. When things go south, she moves on." I thought about sharing this information with my father but decided against it. He was already struggling with the reality of Victoria's true nature. Proof of her past deceptions might break him completely. Instead, I focused on healing what could be healed. The garden was slowly coming back to life, with my father spending weekends helping me replant what had been destroyed. We worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable one filled with shared purpose. One Saturday morning, as we were clearing debris from the flower beds, Victoria made her final play. She arrived in a sleek black SUV, accompanied by two men in expensive suits. "These gentlemen represent my investors," she announced, striding across the lawn. "They're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the property." I straightened up, garden tools still in hand. "The property isn't for sale, at any price." The taller of the two men stepped forward, extending a business card. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside. Our offer might surprise you." "No," I said firmly. "The trust specifically prohibits any sale. It's not negotiable." Victoria's polished facade cracked. "You stupid, sentimental fool. Do you have any idea how much money you're throwing away? All for what? Some old woman's garden." My father, who had been quietly working nearby, finally spoke up. "That old woman was my mother, Victoria. And this garden, this house, they're her legacy, not your next real estate flip." Victoria stared at him, clearly not expecting resistance from that quarter. "James, be reasonable. Think about our future." "I am," he replied, standing to face her. "And I'm starting to think our futures might be heading in different directions." The investors, sensing the shift in dynamics, began backing toward their car. Victoria watched them go, her carefully constructed plans crumbling before her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed, but the threat sounded hollow. "Actually, it is," I said, pulling out my phone. "Mr. Sullivan has been quite thorough in documenting your history of real estate fraud. He's prepared to share his findings with the appropriate authorities if you continue to harass us." She left in a fury of squealing tires and thrown gravel, leaving my father and me standing in the partially restored garden. "I've been such a fool," he said after a long moment. "Not a fool," I corrected him, "just someone who wanted to believe in love again. There's nothing wrong with that." He looked around at the garden, at the evidence of our shared work. "Your grandmother would be proud of you, not just for protecting the property, but for how you did it. With strength, but also with grace. I picked up my gardening tools, returning to the task at hand. She'd be proud of you too, Dad, for finding your way back. As we worked side by side in the late summer sunshine, I thought about everything that had happened. Victoria had tried to turn this place of memories and meaning into just another soulless resort. She had nearly succeeded, not through force, but through manipulation and false promises. But my grandmother had seen it coming. She'd known that the true value of the lake house wasn't in its potential sale price or development opportunities. It was in the generations of memories it held and the ones yet to be made. "What happens now?" my father asked as we finished planting a row of my grandmother's favorite roses. I looked out over the lake, its surface golden in the evening light. "Now we rebuild. Not just the garden, but everything else too." He nodded, understanding that I meant more than just the physical restoration of the property. Trust, like gardens, takes time and care to grow back strong. But standing there, surrounded by the evidence of new growth emerging from old roots, I knew we were on the right path. Victoria's grand plans for Lake Victoria Resort would remain nothing more than glossy renderings in a forgotten folder. The real lake house, my grandmother's lake house, would continue to be exactly what it was meant to be: a home, a haven, a place where family could heal and grow together. The weeks following Victoria's dramatic exit brought a strange new rhythm to life at the lake house. What had started as my solitary mission to protect my grandmother's legacy had evolved into something unexpected. A chance for my father and me to rebuild not just the property, but our relationship. Each morning, we'd arrive with coffee and work plans, tackling the restoration piece by piece. The garden came first, with my father surprising me by remembering many of my grandmother's planting preferences. "She always put the lavender on the eastern edge," he'd say, or "the hydrangeas need more shade than you might think." Small details that revealed he'd paid more attention than I'd given him credit for. Victoria, meanwhile, maintained her distance but not her silence. Her lawyers sent increasingly desperate settlement offers, each one attempting to circumvent the trust's restrictions. "She's running out of options," Mr. Sullivan explained during one of our weekly update calls. "The investors she promised this property to are demanding answers, and from what I can gather, she made some significant financial commitments based on her guaranteed acquisition of the lake house." "Not my problem," I said, watching through the window as my father painstakingly restored the old dock, board by board. "No, it's not," Mr. Sullivan agreed. "But you should be prepared for escalation. People like Victoria rarely accept defeat gracefully." He was right. A week later, Victoria made her final play, a direct appeal to my father that I witnessed through the kitchen window. They stood near the edge of the property, her gestures animated, her expression cycling between pleading and threatening. My father remained still, arms crossed, shaking his head repeatedly. When he finally returned to the house, his expression was grim but resolute. "She wanted me to contest the trust," he said without preamble. "Said if I claimed your grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she created it, we might have a chance to invalidate it." I felt a chill despite the summer warmth. And I told her it was over." He sat heavily at the kitchen table, the weight of his decision evident in every line of his face. "I filed for divorce." The announcement hung in the air between us. This wasn't what I'd expected, or even what I'd wanted, when I first confronted them about the lake house. I'd simply wanted to protect my inheritance, not destroy my father's marriage. "Dad, I never mean. This isn't your fault, Olivia," he interrupted. "Victoria and I, what we had wasn't real. Not on her side anyway. I was just a means to an end, access to properties and connections she could exploit." Mr. Sullivan found evidence of her past schemes, I admitted. "I didn't tell you because I thought it would hurt too much." He nodded, unsurprised. I started doing my own research after that day with the investors, found some of her previous husbands, had some illuminating conversations. He attempted a smile. "Turns out I'm not the first man to fall for her act, just the latest." We sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore filtering through the open windows. "What now?" I finally asked. "Now," he said, looking around at the half-restored kitchen, "we keep rebuilding. The house and everything else." That evening, as the sun set over the lake, we sat on the newly repaired dock with glasses of my grandmother's favorite lemonade. The garden was coming back to life, with new shoots pushing through the soil where Victoria's contractors had torn up the old plants. The house itself was slowly returning to its former charm. The modern fixtures Victoria had installed replaced with pieces more in keeping with its history. "Your grandmother once told me something I didn't understand at the time," my father said, watching the golden light dance across the water. "She said that houses have souls, just like people, that they remember who loved them and who didn't." I smiled, hearing my grandmother's wisdom in his words. She used to tell me that too. Said that's why this place always felt so special, because generations of our family had filled it with love. "I forgot that for a while," he admitted. "Got caught up in Victoria's vision of potential and investment opportunity. Stopped seeing the soul of this place." "But you see it now," I said, not as a question, but as recognition. He nodded, his gaze taking in the familiar shoreline, the gardens beginning to bloom again, the weathered wood of the boathouse that had sheltered our family's small fleet of canoes and kayaks for decades. "I see it," he agreed, "and I'm grateful you fought to protect it, even when that meant fighting me." The sound of a car coming up the driveway interrupted our moment. Mr. Sullivan stepped out, holding a folder. "Good news," he called as he approached the dock. "Victoria has officially withdrawn all claims against the property. The trust stands unchallenged." As Mr. Sullivan explained the legal details, I found myself looking not at him, but at my father. The tension that had lived in his shoulders since this all began had finally eased. He looked more like the father I remember from childhood, present, engaged, at peace. The lake house was safe, just as my grandmother had intended. But she had protected more than just property with her foresight. She had created the opportunity for healing, for truth, for reconciliation. In fighting to preserve her legacy, I'd unexpectedly recovered something I thought was lost forever: my father.